Well, today we're diving into something that's been on my mind lately, the history of electric vehicles. You sent over this Wikipedia article on it, and honestly, I was surprised by how much I didn't know. I mean, it's not just a Tesla and Elon Musk story, right?
Not at all. It's easy to think of EVs as like a new thing, some modern invention. But the truth is, their story, well, goes way back. It's really intertwined with the very beginning of the automobile itself.
Yeah, the article mentions electric model cars, like from the 1820s and 30s. Can you imagine that? Electricity was practically magic back then, and they were already using it to power these, well, mini vehicles. What were they even thinking?
It really speaks to the just boundless curiosity of those early inventors. The 1830s also saw this Scottish chemist, Robert Davidson. He built an electric locomotive, and get this, it actually hauled cargo. And this was just a few years after the first passenger steam trains were up and running in Britain. The electric wasn't lagging behind or anything. It was right there alongside.
Okay, now that's just mind-blowing. So it's not that steam was, like, better in those early days, just maybe more established, more familiar.
Exactly. And that kind of takes us to the late 1800s and early 1900s, what they call the golden age of EVs. It's fascinating. Many of the reasons people were so into them back then are the same reasons EVs are popular now.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, they were quieter, for one,
Hmm.
and of course cleaner, and honestly much easier to operate than those, clunky gasoline cars of the time.
And they had electric taxis back then, too. Imagine that, just hailing an electric ride over a century ago. But I gotta ask, why were EVs seen as superior back then? Was it just the novelty of it all?
It was practicality, too. See, those early gasoline cars were really hard to start. You needed some serious muscle to crank them up. Electric cars, on the other hand, they were simple. No cranking, no gears to mess with, just smooth acceleration. Perfect for getting around those growing cities,
Yeah. Ah, so in a way, those early cities actually worked for electric cars, right? I mean, limited range wouldn't have mattered as much, just driving around the city.
Precisely. And think about it. Without all the noise and fumes of those gasoline engines, electric cars were seen as a solution to the pollution problems that were already starting to pop up in cities. They were a hit with, wealthy urbanites who really valued those benefits.
So even back then, EVs were like I don't know, the trendy, eco-friendly option. But if they were so great, why'd they fade away? What happened?
Well, unfortunately, it's not a simple answer. It's a whole bunch of factors all coming together, really. For one thing, you had improvements in road infrastructure. You could suddenly go on longer journeys. And of course, gasoline cars, with their greater range, well, they were just better suited for that.
So as the world opened up, as they say, range became king, and EVs, well, they just couldn't keep up.
Yeah, and at the same time, you had the discovery of these massive oil reserves. So gasoline suddenly became readily available and, more importantly, affordable. It gave those gasoline cars a huge economic edge.
Right, and you can't forget about Henry Ford's assembly line. Mass production of gasoline cars made them even cheaper. Electric cars were still mostly made by hand back then,
You
right?
got it.
Yeah.
The electric car industry just couldn't compete with what do they call it, the economies of scale of gasoline car production.
Yeah.
It put them at a real disadvantage. It was like a perfect storm. Cheaper gas, cars built for going the distance, and then those technological advances in gasoline engines, like the electric starter. No more breaking your arm trying to crank those things. And, it wasn't just about market forces either. The article, it hints at, well, the oil industry may have had a hand in this. I mean, they were becoming pretty powerful, and they might have used that influence to, slow things down for EVs.
Are you serious? Like some kind of conspiracy to keep electric cars down?
Let's just say their interests and the success of gasoline, they went hand in hand. And they certainly had the power to, shall we say, make their presence felt.
Was it like a deliberate sabotage or just, I don't know, savvy business? That's up for debate. But it's a part of the story you can't really ignore, can you? No, I guess not. Makes you wonder how different things could be if EVs had had a real shot back then. But on a brighter note, people did start to think about them again. The article mentions a revival in the 60s and 70s with all the worries about air pollution and, relying on foreign oil.
Yeah, the 70s energy crisis, that was a real wake-up call.
Yeah.
Suddenly, electric cars didn't seem so out there. People were more open to alternatives. And of course, innovation followed. You had things like the Enfield 8000, a little electric car from Britain. They actually managed to get it into limited production. And then there's the Lunar rover, of course.
Wait a minute, an electric car on the moon? You got to tell me more about this.
It's a perfect example of what electric drive can do, really. Designed by Boeing and GM. That lunar rover was essential for those Apollo missions, for exploring the moon's surface. And actually, the low gravity, it played right into the strengths of an electric vehicle, made it possible to move efficiently over all that rough terrain.
Wow, that's incredible. So while everyone on Earth was dealing with the energy crisis, EV tech was being pushed to its limits in space. Were any of the car companies back here taking notes?
Some of them were starting to dip their toes back in, you could say. GM, for instance, they experimented with electric versions of some of their models, like the Chevrolet Chevette.
Can't say a '70s Chevette screams futuristic EV to me.
Yeah, you're right about that. It wasn't exactly revolutionary. These early attempts, they were really limited by the battery technology at the time. They just couldn't touch the performance of those gas guzzlers. But hey, they were planting seeds. And then in the 90s, things took a more, how do I say it, decisive turn when the California Air Resources Board, CARB as they call it, stepped in.
Ah, yes, CARB. The article talks about their zero emissions mandate, forcing automakers to build electric cars. That was a pretty bold move. How'd the industry take it?
It was a turning point for sure. I mean, CARB's mandate, it came from this real concern about air quality in California, right? It forced the auto industry's hand. Some companies, they saw it as an opportunity. Others, well, not so much.
Sounds about right. So, mixed bag of reactions. What about the cars themselves? Any standouts from that time?
There were a few, yeah. The GM EV1, that was a cool car. Sleek, futuristic, still has a bit of a cult following. But here's the thing, GM, they only offered it for lease. You couldn't actually buy one. And that fueled a whole bunch of conspiracy theories about their true commitment to EVs.
Yeah, I remember that. Seemed like they were almost trying to sabotage it. Weren't there documentaries and all that?
There were, yeah. And then you had the Honda EV Plus, one of the first to use those nickel metal hydride batteries. Now, those batteries, they were more energy dense than the old lead acid ones. Meaning, well, they could store more energy in the same space, so the car could actually go farther on a charge.
So a step forward in battery tech, which, let's be honest, has always been the make or break thing for EVs. But even with these advancements, even with CARB pushing, it still feels like something was holding them back. Why weren't they catching on?
You're right to point that out. Even with the promising stuff happening, that 90s EV revival, it was an uphill battle. Many people, they were still skeptical, worried about range, obviously, and the lack of charging stations.
Range anxiety, that old chestnut. Seems like a recurring theme throughout EV history. But something tells me this story doesn't end there.
It doesn't. The 1990s might have felt like a false start, but they laid the groundwork for a whole new generation of innovators. And one company in particular that would change everything, Tesla. And that's where Tesla comes in. They weren't happy with just building green cars. They wanted to make electric cars that people actually wanted to drive.
Yeah, the Tesla Roadster, that definitely turned some heads back in 2008. A real head-turning sports car that just happened to be electric.
Exactly. Tesla got it. They understood that to change how people thought about EVs, they had to appeal to the heart as much as the header. The Roadster wasn't about compromise. It was about performance and luxury.
It's like they flipped the script on electric cars, right? They weren't just for like eco-warriors anymore. They were cool, aspirational even.
Precisely. And then in 2010, you had the Nissan Leaf entering the scene, a more affordable, practical EV option for the everyday driver.
The Leaf felt like a turning point for sure. It brought EVs closer to the mainstream, showed that electric didn't have to mean expensive or, just for a select few.
It proved that there was a real market for electric cars, and not just for early adopters or diehards. Nissan took a gamble, and it paid off. They really solidified their place as a pioneer in the EV market.
And then came the Model S in 2012. That car was something else. It felt like it redefined what an electric car could be. It wasn't just a way to get around, it was a statement.
The Model S was a game changer, no doubt about it. With its sleek design and impressive range and all that cutting-edge tech like autopilot, it really pushed the boundaries of what people thought an electric car could be. Tesla wasn't just competing with other EVs anymore. They were setting a new standard for the entire auto industry.
And the other car companies, they were finally paying attention, weren't they? It's like the success of Tesla and the Nissan Leaf finally convinced them that this electric thing wasn't going away.
They couldn't ignore it any longer. We started seeing models like the Chevy Bolt, the BMW i3, the Hyundai Kona Electric, the Kia Niro EV. All of a sudden, everyone wanted a piece of the EV pie.
And now it seems like every car company out there is scrambling to electrify their lineup. It's incredible. What do you think changed their minds?
It's a few things. I think, for one, governments around the world are cracking down on emissions. Consumers are more eco-conscious. And, of course, battery technology has come a long way, making EVs more practical and more affordable.
The article also mentioned charging infrastructure that always seemed to be a big obstacle for EVs, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Range anxiety was a huge deal breaker for a lot of people. But now we're seeing massive investments in charging stations, both by private companies and governments. It's getting easier and easier to charge an EV, and that's a big deal if we want people to make the switch.
So, after this deep dive into the history of electric vehicles, what's your biggest takeaway? Where do we go from here?
Well, one thing's for sure. EVs, they're not a fad.
Mm,
They're the future of transportation.
yeah.
We've seen this back and forth, this constant cycle of innovation and setbacks. But this time it feels different. This time you've got technology, policy, and consumer demand all pushing in the same direction. It's pushing EVs into the mainstream.
It really is amazing to think about those early pioneers tinkering away in their workshops. They were onto something groundbreaking. They were just ahead of their time.
And maybe we can learn from the mistakes of the past, from that golden age that faded away, and those false starts in the 90s. This time we have a chance to do it right, to make electric vehicles a sustainable and essential part of our transportation future.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the history of the electric vehicle. It's a story of innovation, perseverance, and ultimately a glimpse into a future where transportation is cleaner, quieter, and powered by electricity. It really makes you wonder what's next for the EV. What will the next chapter hold? Only time will tell.